Hello, everyone. Nice to see you here today. I'm Jason Taylor. I'm a solution architect in Brisbane for a company named Increment, and I'm also a Microsoft MVP in developer technologies. I'm excited to be here today at the Copenhagen Developers Festival, and I'm even more excited to be presenting my new talk, Unleashing Clean Architecture in .NET 8. Now, this is very much a show and tell style talk. I'll be showing you how to use my clean architecture solution template, show you how to set up your development environment, how to create a new solution, how to build, test, and run the solution locally, and how to use the built-in pipelines as code and infrastructure as code to deploy the solution to production. I'll also be telling you about some of the features that I've included in the template, which have been designed to enable you to focus on delivering business value rather than setting up new solutions, setting up projects, setting up infrastructure and pipelines. Let's get started. So the Clean Architecture Solution template provides a simple and straightforward approach to enterprise application development with clean architecture and ASP.NET Core. Now, it's easy to get started. It's a .NET project template, and that means you can run it from the command line using .NET New or from Visual Studio 22 File New Project. It's been built on .NET. The original version was released in October of 2019 on .NET 3.1, and it's been upgraded to 5, 6, 7, and the largest upgrade by far has been to .NET 8. Now, if you're looking at starting a new solution in any time now, .NET 8 would be a great choice. That's the long-term support release, and as the LTS release, that means it's going to be supported in production for 3 years. Now, we should receive a go-live license in about 1 week, and then the official release for .NET 8 will be in November at .NET Conf. So with the .NET upgrade, there was a lot of new features that I added that were requested by users of the template for many years. So one of the first and biggest ones was support for multiple front-end frameworks. So we now support Angular, React, and Web API out of the box. I've also added support for multiple databases. I've started with SQLite and SQL Server, but I'll be looking to add PostgreSQL quite soon. Now, you know there's been a lot of changes with the ASP.NET Core templates in regards to authentication and authorization. .NET 8's been quite a big upgrade. So I've adjusted my templates to align with those changes. So I've removed Duende Identity Server and using the simple approach now with ASP.NET Core Identity for Angular and React, and also the new Identity API for the Web API only solution. One of the really big things was implementing a full CI/CD pipeline as code and also infrastructure as code, because I want users of the template, no matter what level they're coming from, to have a good chance to do things right on day 0. So using this template, you can establish a new CI/CD pipeline with GitHub Actions and deploy the solution to Azure using bicep templates. I've also included scripts so that it makes sure that GitHub, Azure, the resources, and the credentials all get set up for you. And of course, the template is still freely available and open source on GitHub. So if you do find it useful, please give it a star. All right, so installing the template is straightforward. You can do that from the command line, .NET New install Clean Architecture Solution template. Now, the current version of the template is a preview version, so you'd need to specify the version, otherwise you'll get the .NET 7 version, but I'll show you that. Now, once you've done that, you can create a new solution just by going .NET New CA Solution. There's a few options that are available in the template. So you can specify the standard options, the name, the output, but also the client framework. So this is where you can specify either Angular, React, or none if you'd prefer a Web API only solution. You can also specify that you'd like to use SQLite. By default, it will use SQL Server, but if you choose SQLite, then that's fine, and that'll work across all different environments. So the example there is creating a new React front end with an ASP.NET Core backend. It'll be called CPH DevFest. Now, because it's a .NET template, it does some really cool stuff when you create a new project. It's going to use that folder name, the output directory CPH DevFest, as the solution name. and it'll also have namespaces CPH DevFest. But remember, there's pipelines as code and infrastructure as code in that template as well. And so that means those pipelines and infrastructure are going to be customized with CPH DevFest as well. So when you download this and create a new solution, you're pretty much ready to go. So if you wanted to create a new solution using Visual Studio 2022, just install the template, and then that project template will be available in the Create a New Project dialog. So very easy to get started. I want to jump into the first demo. So the first demo, we're going to prepare your development environment. We'll create a new solution, make sure the template's installed, make sure you've got the correct version of .NET installed. We'll build it, run it, test it, and then deploy it to production, because we don't want to waste any time with this one, right? All right, so I'm going to jump into Windows Terminal. And first thing I want to do, you should probably wish me luck, it's quite a lot to do, but hopefully with the template, it's all automated, fingers crossed. I'll check the .NET version. So if I go .NET version 8 preview 7. So we're on the latest version. So if you don't have the latest version, you can go off to .NET and grab it. I also want to make sure that I've got the GitHub CLI installed. And this is going to be used by one of the scripts that will set up the Azure resources. That's great. And you know what? I might as well go ahead and create a new GitHub repo while we're at it. So let's go GitHub repo, create. I got some help there. CPH DevFest. We'll make it a public repository and we'll clone it straight away. There we go. So we can jump into CPH DevFest, and we can go GitHub browse, and we can see that repository is ready to go. Okay, so we want to install the Clean Architecture Solution template. So as mentioned, it's .NET install clean.architecture.solution.template. And we need to specify the version because it's a preview version. So I think we can just go 8 star. Now if that's already installed, that's off to a good start. File was not found. .NET new install. There we go. If it's already installed, it's just gonna reinstall it for me, make sure everything's right. So you can see there's 2 templates there. There's the CA solution, which you've already looked at, and then there's the CA use case. So this has got some item templates in there to help you generate use cases to make it a little bit easier to build the functionality that you'll need to build. And we'll have a look at those a little bit later. But right now, I want to create the new solution. So we're in that CPH DevFest directory. So we'll go .NET new, CA solution, client framework. We'll choose none. We'll go with Web API just because it'll build a little bit quicker for us. And so that creates the solution. So we see we're ready to go. We've got an Azure directory, which includes all of our bicep templates. We've got a GitHub directory, which includes our GitHub actions. We've got a scripts directory, which will help us set up our CI/CD pipeline and all of the Azure resources. And then we've got source for our main projects, tests for our other projects, and a whole bunch of other files there. So the first thing I want to do is build this. So I'll run .NET build TL. And TL is the new modernized build output. And so you can see there it's kind of doing this inline build. If there's some issues, it'll show us more specifically where the issues have occurred. So it's not this big wall of text anymore, which I think is quite nice. It'll just take a little while to get through this first build. It'll go ahead and add support for OpenAPI, so it's going to build a specification as part of the build. But once that's done, we'll go ahead and run this solution. Let's go. Okay. There we go. Okay, so if I go ahead and run the solution, first I just need to jump into the web directory. So we're going to source, start web, .NET, run. Okay, so this is a web API only, so it'll just launch the solution and we can have a look at Swagger UI. So we're not going to get too much into the details of the UI or anything like that, just to make sure that it's running. There we go. Okay. So I'll go ahead and run the tests. There's a whole bunch of test projects built into this solution to help get you started on the right foot. Whoops, cd back, cd tests. And so you can see there I've got some application layer functional tests, unit tests, some domain unit tests, and a placeholder for your integration tests. So if I go .NET test, and we'll just go no build, make it nice and quick. So we just want to make sure everything's working right before we go ahead and deploy this thing to production. So I'm just doing some sanity checks. It makes sure that my development environment's set up correctly. But really we want to, that's not good. Oh, that's Docker. All right. One thing I forgot to do. We want to make sure that this is going to be okay and that everything's in place. So I'm pretty confident. So let's go ahead and add those files and commit. Ta-da, this is a new project. Okay, now before I push that through, because when I do push it through, it's going to make those changes, it'll kick off the pipeline. I just need to configure GitHub and the repository that I've created, make sure that it has all the environments that I want to support. I want to support development, staging, and production. I also need to configure the variables that will be associated with that repository so that it can connect to Azure. So we need things like the tenant ID, the client app, everything that, some secrets for SQL Server, admin passwords, and things like that. We also need to head off to Azure, and we need to set up some Azure AD app registration, some federated credentials, and all those sorts of things. So obviously we can't do that very quickly unless we've got some scripts. So I've created some scripts to do that for us. So inside of scripts, we've got two, setup.ps1 and cleanup.ps1. Now, obviously, you shouldn't jump in and run these scripts without understanding exactly what they do. The cleanup one is especially destructive because it will go and delete resources from Azure. But once you have done that, and once you've read the warning that comes up and the disclaimer that comes up, and if you type yes, it will go and do these things. So I didn't have to pass any parameters because this script tries to figure it out based on the environment that we have here. So I've got a couple of things running. I've got the Azure CLI running, and I've got the GitHub CLI running. And so it's able to use those tools to look at, well, the GitHub repository name is CPH DevFest. We'll assume the project name is CPH DevFest. We've got our Azure subscription ID because I've gone in to using the Azure CLI and actually set the right subscription. So you should always go and do that. I've got the tenant ID, the location. I default it to Australia East because that's where I am most of the time. I've got the default SQL login, SQL admin, and I've got my GitHub organization name. So all of these defaults have been collected, but of course you can pass them in as parameters as well. And it just gives us a list of the environments that we're going to create and the abbreviations that it's going to use. So if I say continue, then this script is going to go off and set up environments, resources, and credentials, as it says here, for a project hosted on GitHub and deployed to Azure. It'll create the workload identities, Azure AD, set up resource groups and configure environment-specific variables and secrets, blah, 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 blah. It'll do all the work for us. So that's good. So if I hit yes, that's going to kick off that process. And so this is something that will save me a lot of time because if I'm starting a new project, I don't want to have to create a new solution and start adding files and start building tests and installing all of my favorite packages. And I also don't want to establish the first pipeline and the first infrastructure. So that's what I've built into this template. I've built in the capability that when I start a new project based on my specialization, I can go to a client site and on day one, in the first 45 minutes, I can get it deployed through to production. Okay, and that means that from that point forward, I can focus on delivering business value. I can focus on building new features. Now that pipeline's going to change, the infrastructure's going to change, but I've started those things from the simplest approach possible for enterprise application development, okay? So it's a really good starting point. So let's see how this goes. Shouldn't take too much longer. Let's go and have a look in GitHub at some of the environments and things that are being created. So if I go into settings, and into environments here, I can see the development environment has already been created. So we've got a multi-stage deployment in GitHub, and development's got 1 secret and 3 variables. So we can jump in here. I could put some protection rules on this branch if I wanted to. I could set some required reviewers. So for staging and production, that's something that I definitely want to do. For development, I'm just going to let it flow through. I won't do any required reviewers as part of this demonstration because I'll forget to do it while we're talking about other things, and then it won't go all the way through. So if we have a look at some of the environment secrets here, that's a really cool new thing in GitHub Actions. I don't know how new it is, but sometime this year we got the capability for environment-specific secrets and variables, which is really, really good feature that we need. So we've got the Azure SQL Administrator password, the client ID. So that's the client ID for the application in Azure AD that's specific to the development environment. And then the resource group name, so you can see CPH DevFest, and the default SQL Administrator username. So if we have a look at other environments, we've got production, staging, development. They look like they're all set up. So this script is probably finished running. And so if we go over to Azure, we'll see that resource groups and all that sort of thing have been set up. I'll log in. I'm not going to do that. So we'll see the resource groups have been set up. They'll be empty right now because we haven't deployed anything, but they're there ready to receive all of the Azure resources that we'll push through. And we'll also see in Azure AD that there's application registrations for development, staging, and production, and also the credentials necessary for GitHub to talk to Azure and actually be able to deploy those resources. So now with that done, the only thing I really have to do is push those changes through. So that's the initial project getting pushed through. And if we go over here, we can see, fingers crossed. Yep, that's all pushed through. And if we go to actions, we can see the pipeline is starting to kick off. And so we're going to go into details with the pipeline. Where did that go? But for now, I just want to make sure it starts correctly. There we go. Yeah, so it's installing .NET, installing .NET 8 Preview 7, and it'll go through and do all of the things necessary to build and produce those artifacts. So let's tick that. We'll let that tick over, keep our fingers crossed that it goes all the way through, and we'll look at some of the features that have been included in the template to make your life easier. All right. I noticed this down here. I thought I didn't really see that was there. I kind of saw it in the back of my mind. You guys should have shouted it out. You've got to have my backup here. I've got to do all of these live demos. So if something doesn't look right, just let me know. All right. So one of the things that I did in this version of the template was to improve the framework and package management. So you can see here I've got the required .NET SDK version specified in the global.json. So it's specifying version 8 Preview 7, but it'll roll forward to the latest major release. Now, I've also included a directory build.props, and that specifies common props for all of the projects in that directory. So for all of the projects, .NET 8 is specified. Treat warnings as errors is specified because we don't want people committing code with warnings in that we then have to look at. And implicit usings are nullable across all projects. And finally, I've got directory.packages.props included. So we have central package management. And that means that we specify our packages and those versions in one place. And then within the CS projects, we just specify the package without the versions. And that means if I want to, say, move from .NET 8 Preview 7 to RC1, I only have to change one file and the associated packages. So 2 files, maybe one, if I just ignore the fact that my SDK is supporting an older version. But I should say global.json is used by the CI/CD pipeline to install the appropriate SDK as part of the build. So we'd need to change it there, and then also in this one back here. So the directory.package.props. So if I've got 5 different test projects and I want to go and update X unit or N unit, as the example is here, I can just change it in one file in one place, and that will update all of those test projects. So when you've got a solution that's just one project, this sort of thing doesn't matter. But when you've got 7 or 8 projects, having centralized framework and package management is really useful. All right, next up, dependency injection. So I'm using DI with .NET out of the box. but I tend to break up project service dependencies into individual modules. So I create a extension method on iService collection, and that way I can register, say, all of the services for infrastructure in the infrastructure project, all of the services for the application layer in the application project. And that really helps to keep my composition route, which is program.cs, nice and simple and clean. So you can see there, the only services I'm registering in program.cs are these extension methods: add application services, add infrastructure services, pass in the configuration, and add web services. Nice and simple, much easier to maintain. All right, now for the web API, we've included the API with built-in support for ASP.NET Core Minimal API. Now, I didn't want to use Minimal API straight out of the box because for me, it's missing some features that I'd really like to see. One of those features is routing conventions. I don't want to have to specify using magic strings all of the routes and all of the names throughout it, and so I've added extension methods to support the defaults and routing conventions that I would typically use. Now there are numerous options for organization of API endpoints, and I wanted to just discuss that. So the first option is all endpoints in a single file, such as program.cs. And we see this example a lot, and it's fine if you're building a really small application with a tiny number of endpoints, then maybe that's going to work well for you. But generally for enterprise application development, not so much. Now you could also have individual endpoints in separate files, such as get weather forecasts. And so with this approach, all of the logic for the endpoint is in a single file, and you might even take it a step further, and you might have a folder for that endpoint, and also put in the input types and the response types. And so you have this single location where you can go and work on that endpoint. And I think that works well for larger applications where you have a lot of logic in the endpoint, and it makes sense to have it all in that one place. The third approach is to group endpoints, related endpoints, into a single file, such as user.cs. So in user.cs, I might have the ability to log in, to register, that sort of thing. And this works well, again, for large enterprise applications where there are a lot of endpoints to manage, but where there's not so much logic in each endpoint. And that pretty much describes the type of APIs that I create. They're very small, very thin, very little logic, and so I've decided to group my related endpoints into a single file. Now, let me just show you what that looks like. So if I go over to this one, I've got an example here of my to-do lists. And so you can see here, I've created a to-do list file inside of an endpoints folder. And so I've got to-do list, to-do items, users, and weather forecasts. I've got a endpoint group base, which specifies a map method. We pass in web application, and then we can use the web application to register our endpoints. So you can see here I'm calling map group. Now this isn't the one that comes out of the box. The one that comes out of the box has a few different options, but I like to actually customize what map group does for the way I typically like to build an API. So this one's an extension method. So what happens is it will look at the type. In this case, the type is to-do list, and it'll go ahead and make a group where the base route will be API/to-do list. And then it will set the group name, the group tags, and specify that these endpoints will use OpenAPI. Those are the defaults that I like to use whenever I'm creating a group of endpoints. The same thing's happening here. Require authorizations built in, because these are extension methods, right? So I've extended the capabilities of Minimal API with the way that I like to work, but I haven't reduced the capabilities. So we're still using the Minimal API framework, and so we can use all of this nice fluent API to build it out. You can see with map get, this is an extension method as well. So I go and put some defaults in here. So instead of specifying the name in a magic string, I'm actually getting the name of the handler that I'm passing through, which is get to-do lists. So my route for this particular endpoint will be /API /to-do list /get to-do lists. And so you can see that I've leveraged Minimal API and extended Minimal API in a way that makes it easy for me to work with. So I can go ahead and create one of these groups. I can use all of my extension methods so I don't have to write so much code. And I've got the very, very small methods listed in one file. because my logic doesn't live in the API, right? It's off in the application layer and in the domain layer. Okay. So groups are defined in separate files. They're derived from endpoint group base, which is the type that I created. We implement the map method. We use the extension methods to then register our groups and our endpoints. And then inside of program.cs, I've got another extension method on web application, which will then just go through and automatically wire up all of my endpoints. So I just call app.map endpoints. And that's pretty nice and clean. I really like working with it that way. All right, I've also implemented the new exception handler that came with .NET 8, and this allows us a mechanism for managing known exception types in a kind of controlled way. So you can see here that I've created a custom exception handler that is implementing the exception handler interface. And what it will do is I will add logic to handle known exception types. And if the exception is handled by my custom logic, then I'll return true. Otherwise, I'll return false. Now, typically, the way that I'd build this in the past was using filters. But this provides us with a really unique opportunity. Instead of handling all known types in a single filter, we can actually have multiple exception handlers. So we can have one for not found if that's what we're doing, and one for validation if that's what we're doing. And so what will happen is the middleware will use these exception handlers, passing it to the next exception handler if the first one doesn't handle it for us. And that means that we're able to adhere to SRP quite closely and just have one type handled per exception handler. So I like that. It's easy to register these exception handlers. We just go services.add exception handler. Let's have a look and see how the deployment's going. Okay, still ticking along. That's good news. Okay, so it has, let's zoom in there. So it's gone through and it's done the build, it's done the validation of infrastructure, and it's started the development deployment. So it's moving through fairly well. So as part of that, it's building up the infrastructure, initializing the database, and deploying the actual site. Okay. The template has built-in support for OpenAPI, so it'll improve your productivity and allow you to easily adapt to API changes. So I like to generate my OpenAPI specification on build, and it's based on the included web API. So Swagger UI is included out of the box, so you can visualize and interact with the API endpoints. And for the Angular and React templates, I generate TypeScript clients for those front ends. And so that means you don't have to write your own code to interact with the backend API. In fact, your front-end developers don't even need to look at the backend API. If you've got two teams, perhaps, they can just look at this generated client. It's going to include all of the clients you'll need to interact with the API. It's going to include bearer tokens, so authorization is taken care of. And it's also going to include TypeScript versions of those types that are exposed by your API. So it makes life really easy. Now, the React template was a little bit tricky to get to work. I've customized the NSwag template that has been generated, and so it supports authorization as well. So you won't need to jump through hoops to get it to work with ASP.NET Core Identity or any other authorization techniques. I've also included a web.http file, so you can see how the API is designed to work, jump in, have a play with it, and get a better understanding of it. All right, next up for authentication and authorization, this is supported through ASP.NET Core Identity. So the Angular and React SPAs use ASP.NET Core Identity UI and cookie-based authentication, whereas the web API-only apps use the new Identity API endpoints, which is excellent. It comes out of the box with a group of endpoints, such as login, register, refresh, and we'll be able to use those when we're building out our Angular and React apps, Blazor apps, because now we don't need to rely on that Razor UI, and we don't have to build this API ourselves. So in the past, we kind of maybe scaffold out the identity UI, have a look at how things are working, build an API based on that. That is done now, and it's quite simple. When I created the kind of approach to minimal API for my solution, I knew when I saw this and when I included the map identity API that my solution was working really well, because I was able to go in and define a group in a really simple way and then just call .map identity API, which is built by the team, and it just works. And for me, it looks really nice and simple and organized. So we'll see all of those endpoints in this particular solution at /API, /users, and then all of the endpoints that come with Map Identity API. That's an example. That example is from Preview 7. In Preview 8, there's a whole host of new endpoints that you can check out. So data access is supported using Entity Framework Core, either with SQLite or SQL Server. But of course, those are just the options that are built into the template. If you want to go and use something else, you're free to do so. As mentioned, I'll be including PostgreSQL shortly. EF Core migrations is enabled, and it's almost completely automated. So you still have to go in and create migrations, of course, but in development time, there is an initializer that will create the database, update it to the latest migration, and seed the database. And then for the CI/CD pipeline, for all of your deployed environments, it's going to use EF Core migrations bundles. So you're not going to have to figure out how to get that working. It will build the bundle as part of the build pipeline. Once the infrastructure is deployed, it will use that bundle to upgrade your database to the known version. And of course, because it's built into the CI/CD pipeline, if the bundle, if the database upgrade fails, you'll know before the solution is deployed to production and before your user jumps on the phone and says, hey, this app doesn't even start. All right, so database initialization, yeah. Let's see, deployed environments use EF Core migrations. EF Core Fluent API is used to configure entities where required. So I like to keep my data model sometimes as a dual purpose domain model. I want that to be as clean as possible, so I use the Fluent API for that. I've also implemented some examples of EF Core interceptors in this template, so you can see some examples of auditing entities and dispatching domain events. Now, there's a number of core features that are built into this solution, and these are the features that are built into the core of the architecture. So this is the application layer and the domain layer, independent of any kind of external technology. So we have automatic validation of invoked use cases, and this is powered by Mediator using a validation behavior and Fluent validation. We also have the ability to specify authorization requirements on use cases, and that means we can go and specify things like roles and policies. This is an abstraction that is implemented in infrastructure on ASP.NET Core Identity. So the abstraction can remain, but you can change out whatever identity process you're using. We automatically log unhandled exceptions, automatically log invoked use cases. So when you go and have a look at that, you'll see the use case name, the input for the use case, and also details of the user. We add and dispatch domain events, support for value objects, support for auditable entities. That's again powered by EF Core interceptors. And here's the CI/CD pipeline. Let's check and see how that's running. Okay, so it looks like it's finished the deployment to development. So we can probably go and jump on and see if that's working. So if we go to deploy website and click on that, fingers crossed. We'll come back to it, give it some time to load. Okay, so the CI/CD pipeline is a multi-stage pipeline. It's included in the template, and it's a pipeline as code, so it's built on GitHub Actions. So the first thing this pipeline does is build the solution. So we saw when we had a let's dive in and have a look at that build actually. So in build here, it's going to install .NET, install the latest SDK, restore the solution, build the solution, test the solution, okay? It's going to publish the website, so it's going to create that website artifact, which will then be used later to deploy it to Azure. It will also create the EF Core migrations bundle and publish that artifact as well. So once build's done, it'll kick off with a multi-stage deployment to development, staging, and production. The first thing it does is using the bicep templates is to deploy the infrastructure. Now there's some validation that happens on those bicep templates before they run. So you do have an opportunity to actually, if you put in some required approvers, you have an opportunity to review the changes that will be made to Azure if you click approve and continue. So that's why you're seeing some additional steps in here. So for the deploy to development, there was a validate stage to check those templates and a deploy stage. For the deploy to staging, there was a validate stage which was running a what if. So we can go and have a look at the changes that will be made if we decide to go ahead with this deployment. Okay, so there's the dev environment up and running and ready to go. So not much to see there. It's an API, but it was a successful deployment. Okay, so the continuous delivery pipeline will deploy the infrastructure and then initialize the database. So the initialize of the database is happening using the EF Core migrations bundle. And just for clarity, the migrations bundle is a cross-platform application that will upgrade your database to the correct migration. And you don't have to manage that. And then finally, it will deploy the website. Now, the infrastructure as code, as mentioned, has been built using bicep templates. Now, I've based this on the Azure reference architecture for a basic web application because I figured we need the simplest starting point before we dive into the details and figure out actually what is this application going to be about? Is it multi-tenanted? Let's get something up and running so we can start building features, and we'll start to evolve the CI/CD pipeline and the infrastructure as code from a place that works, right? And that's important. We've got something that works, and we can build on it as we understand more. So you can see there we'll have an app service plan with an app. We've got a SQL Server database, and we've got application insights wired up and receiving metrics across those services. Now, there's also support for code scaffolding. So when you installed the template, you got, of course, the CA solution template, which is a .NET project template for building the solution, but you also received the CA use case template. And so this template is something that you typically run from within the application directory where the application project lives. This is where we create the use cases, the reason that this application exists. An example of use cases might be dispatching an order or creating a new customer. So we run it by going .NET new CA use case, and there's a number of options that we can specify. So first thing is the feature name, and that will go ahead and create a feature folder in the application directory if it doesn't exist. Then we have the use case type, either a command or query, because in this approach we're using CQRS. And next we have the name, which is the name of the use case being created. So let's give some examples. So the feature name might be orders, and the use case name might be dispatch order. And then finally, we have the return type, which is optional, depending on what type of use case you're creating. So as an example here, we've got .NET new CA use case, feature name of orders, use case type of command, and name of dispatch order. And so that'll give us a nice skeleton that we can get started with and go and start adding our application logic to that skeleton. Finally, documentation. So when you create a new template, when you create a new solution using the template, it includes a README file, which is generated automatically and is based on the version of the template that you created. So if you create an Angular app, a React app, or a Web API only app, it'll be specific to that. And it includes steps, basic tasks such as building and running the app, code scaffolding to generate use cases, details on code styles and formatting using editor config, running the automated tests, and help and other resources. It also includes the version of the template that was used to create the solution. So if at some point you want to go back to the clean architecture solution template and look at what's new and what has changed, you'll have a point at which you can compare that. All right, let's have a look and see how our deployment's going. Okay, so it looks like it's in the final stages now. So it's going through and deploying to production. Check in there. So yes, it's finished the initial stages. It's deploying infrastructure. Then it'll go through and initialize the database before finally deploying the website. So it looks like that's going to be successful, which is good. So it's been running for 22 minutes now. So that means that if we're on client site, first day on the job, it's 9 a.m. This is going to be finished within the 45 minutes at least, and we'll be able to grab a coffee before the kickoff meeting, which is nice. That's how I like to operate. Whoops. All right, thank you for coming to my talk today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Now, if you'd like to learn more, you can jump on to github.com at Jason Taylor Dev Clean Architecture, and there you can learn more about the template. You can request a new feature, request a bug fix, and you can have conversations with other people, contributors and users, about the template and how best to use it. If you do find the template to be useful, I'd really appreciate it if you give it a star on GitHub. Thank you. Plenty of time for questions if anyone has any. Yep. Sorry, why do I separate them into separate? Two reasons. So why do I append kind of the name of the? Yes, that's right. So the question was, in the minimal API approach, let's see. I'm going to bring up the code. So actually, maybe we can even just go to Swagger UI. Okay, so the question is, why do I append the name of the method to the route? Is that right? So you can see there that I'm not. Really what's happening is the name of the method is being used to provide a richer set of data to API Explorer, so that when it goes and builds the specification, it's going to be able to build us a nice OpenAPI specification. And it's going to organize things into those groups. So you can see there we've got a grouping of our to-do items, to-do lists, and users. Actually, we can come here and see all of the wonderful endpoints that the team has put in for working with ASP.NET Core Identity. They've really gone above and beyond. I don't know if we'll see any more as part of the .NET 8 release, because I think it'll be about stabilization now with RC1 and RC2, but that's a really great starting point. Any other questions? Yes? Sorry, I can't. You'll have to come forward, sorry. Yes, that's a good question. So thank you for using the template. So the upgrade of the template, how do we do that? There's no supported upgrade process. And when I generated the README that I showed you before, the reason that I put the version in there is so that you always know what version the solution was created from. So the simplest thing you could do to see what's new is go back and install that version of the template, create a new empty solution, and then install the latest version, create a new empty solution, and compare the two. That at least is going to give you an idea of what's new, but you can also go through and check the release notes, because when I do a new release, I try to describe what's changed so you could dive in and grab those things that you're interested in. Yeah, it's not an easy problem to solve, but at least if you know the version it was created from, you've got a good starting point, a reference point. Yes? That's a great question. Are there any plans to add Blazor to the template? I've been very busy working on this one, but I do have a Blazor template, and this one is for Blazor WebAssembly. So, we're about to run out of time. So it's called Rapid Blazor. It's on .NET 7, and one of the things that I'll be doing next is fixing that failing build and deploy, but after that I'll be upgrading it to .NET 8 as well. So the Rapid Blazor template is similar. It's got a built-in CI/CD pipeline. It's got built-in infrastructure as code templates. And what else does it have? It's got some scripts to help you get started, but it's not quite as easy. So I'll need to take what I've learned, all the changes that I've made to the Clean Architecture Solution template, and apply it to Rapid Blazor. And it's starting to get tricky because now I've got too many open source projects to maintain. So if you do have some time and you are interested and you'd like to contribute, I'd welcome some contributions. If you're not sure where to start, you can ask me and we can figure out a good place to start. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you have any plans to extend this template to use Azure DevOps pipelines instead of GitHub Actions?
That's a great question. Do I have any plans to extend the template to use Azure DevOps pipelines as well as GitHub Actions? Yeah. Something that's really interesting me at the moment is the Azure Developer CLI. And they're doing a lot of great work. And I'd like to see how much I can leverage the Azure Developer CLI as part of this template. So then I would have a .NET project template that uses the Azure Developer CLI that's able to deploy GitHub Actions pipelines, Azure DevOps pipelines, Bicep templates, or Terraform templates. And I think that might be a good starting point, but I worry that it's not going to support a multi-stage pipeline. So I'm tracking some of the issues on that repository to see if they're adding support for that. So I will add support for Azure DevOps pipelines pretty soon. It's not a big task, but I'm not sure whether that'll come through Azure Developer CLI or directly into the template. Yes? So could you ask again? No, but what about GitLab? Am I planning to add support for CI/CD for GitLab? No, I'm not planning to add support, but I would welcome a contribution on that. So for me, an open source project, building in my spare time, I tend to focus on the things that I do. And so for me, that's Azure DevOps pipelines and GitHub Actions. But if somebody puts through a contribution for GitLab, that'd be appreciated, and I'd definitely include it in the template. Any last questions? Okay, wonderful. Thanks again, everyone. Bye.